Hello and welcome today. This is a webinar about the Microsoft Power Platform and Blackbaud Razor's Edge NXT, specifically Power Apps. And I am Cody Jackson. I'm going to be presenting to you today. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we begin. One, this recording will be available after the webinar. It will be emailed to you as a follow-up. Audio is being broadcast through your computer. If you have any issues, make sure the media player is active. If you're still having issues, try refreshing your browser and close down anything that's taking up your bandwidth. Also, feel free to use questions. And as I'll call out, if I'm doing a demo, which will happen in the middle of the webinar, you'll need to open up the media player to see what I'm doing. So before we jump into it, a tiny bit about me. I am Cody Jackson. I'm from North Dallas in Texas. So if you notice, I'll say y'all and howdy maybe more than once. I've worked with Razor's Edge, NXT, eTapestry, Award Management, Stewardship Management, BB&C, and Luminate Online. Quite a lot of Blackbaud products in my time here. Been here for about 3 years. I've taught thousands of college students and also corporate students doing a whole bunch of training, both in person, online, and e-learning. Fun fact is I'm a triplet, so that means I'm an identical brother and a fraternal sister. And the fun part is I'm actually using his headshots for this webinar right now. We kind of alternate taking professional headshots because we look so similar. And more relevant to y'all is that I'm an avid user of the Microsoft Power Platform. Here I am predominantly on the documentation team, and using a Power Automate workflow, I saved about 10 hours a week, and 10 hours a week for one of our senior managers, just collecting, organizing, and automating feedback reports. And so I'm a real believer in what we're doing today and really excited to dive on in. So just a really quick sales pitch. This is the last in a series of 6 webinars all about the Blackbaud Marketplace. You'll see the link up in the screen above, hello.blackbaud.com/Blackbaud Marketplace. And in there you can get a lot of information about the Sky Developer, our Sky Developer platform, Sky UX. You can learn more about Power Automate, which is kind of the workflow builder, and then there's also this webinar, which is kind of an app builder. And so I'd highly encourage you to check those out. They're led by some very technical but very, very smart and relatable people. And so you can just learn a whole lot about Blackbaud's ecosystem and how you can best leverage Razor's Edge NXT. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, this is probably the least technical of all of the Sky Developer presentations. And the goal of that is, we want to make sure that you get up and running with this as quickly as possible, and then you can start getting into the really fun, complicated things. So for today's scenario, let's say you're an organization that is highly dependent on volunteers. Maybe you're a food bank or Meals on Wheels or some other thing like that. You really, really depend on volunteer work. And let's say you have either an in-person event or, I guess now, probably more likely it's an online event. But so you're trying to collect sign-ups. And you're collecting sign-ups, so say if you're in person, you have a couple of issues with that. Everybody goes up, they sign their name, name, email address, telephone number. One, what if you can't read their handwriting? You can have some issues contacting them. What if you lose that sheet of paper? I know that that's definitely happened to me at a church event before. It's like, oh, shoot. And there go all of our potential volunteers. But even, and this is the same if you had a digital sign-up of somebody filling out a Google form or something like that. Even if you have this information already on a computer, already typed up, how do you get it into your database? How do you, connect this action that they're taking with their overall constituent record? So it's going to take a lot of work, regardless of whether you have something or you don't. And so that's why we're going to build a volunteer sign-up form that's connected right to Razor's Edge NXT. And so today's scenario, we're going to be building, it is a very, very simple volunteer sign-up form, just 3 fields, a submit button. But again, as I emphasized, the important part of this isn't just that it captures information and it doesn't require, deciphering handwriting, but it also can hook up directly into your database, which is a real value add and saves a lot of time. And just an overview of prerequisites. Before you get started, you're going to need to have a subscription to Razor's Edge NXT. I assume most people already here have that. You can't put information into your database if you don't have a database. 2, you're going to need a subscription to Microsoft Power Apps. The connector is free on the Blackbaud side. There is a small fee associated with the Microsoft side of it, and there's some resources and some of those links that you'll be able to use to get a better sense of what that is. And finally, imagination. It is a little bit hokey, but it is very important both to be able to think, hey, what is my problem? And understand what problems work well with Power Apps, but then also being able to see, okay, hey, like here's how my problem fits into Power Apps. How do all of the pieces work together? And that takes a little bit of imagination and a little bit of training if you're not used to it. As we're talking about Power Apps, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Power Apps is a Microsoft kind of build your own app interface that lets you build a professional grade app the easy way, just without having to think about a lot of the really crazy developer stuff. You don't have to know about APIs. You don't have to know about web development. You just kind of have to know how to drag boxes around and set a couple properties, and then you have an app ready to go. And the reason that we're talking about this is we now have a Razor's Edge NXT connector available for the Power Platform. So that's for Power Apps, Power Automate, which is building workflows, Power Virtual Agents, which is using Microsoft chatbots and other things like that. So we're excited because it allows you to connect to a ton of different things, especially things outside your database. So let's say we're building this volunteer sign-up form. We have 3 potential solutions, and we'll cover the second 2 today. So the first one is you could just set up a Microsoft or Google form and connect it into Power Automate. That's all within Power Automate. If you want more detail about that, go to the other workflow or the other webinar. We also have some sample workflows online that do just that. That's your simplest option. If you want a little bit more customization on how that looks, you could have Power Apps for the front end and then Power Automate doing all the work behind the scenes. That's the first scenario we're going to talk through today. And finally, if you want the most control over everything, if you're very technically minded, you may just want to do Power Apps, do all of the logic inside of that. And a quick warning, we're about to do a demo. Doing a live demo is a little bit like working with live animals. Sometimes things go wrong. But if you just bear with me, we will go through and watch a couple demos and get started. Okay, and so jumping in, we have 3 different ways that we can make an application. Well, I guess a couple of different ways. We could start from blank, from data, from a template. But the way that we're going to talk about today are starting from blank. So we're going to do a Canvas app from blank. It works very similarly to PowerPoint in terms of dropping and dragging things around. Model-driven apps, it's kind of related to how different records have different properties. I fully don't understand it myself, so I wouldn't recommend starting there. It's pretty dang complicated. There's also a portal, and that might be something if you want a lot of people logging in and seeing information, so something like an alumni or volunteer portal. But we're going to start with this Canvas app from blank. Say webinar test 51. I don't know how many of these I've done. So Power Apps is going to think about what it wants to do. Give you a little bit of time to think about your life, your choices, what you might be having for lunch today. Whatever you want, you'll just have a little bit of time to think. So okay, when it finishes, it'll take you to this blank screen, and we're going to go ahead and start by inserting some stuff on this screen. So I'm going to start off with some HTML text. We're going to say it's going to be a volunteer sign up form. And we're going to adjust a few of the properties on here. I think just make it a little bit bigger. We're going to add in 3 text inputs. So we want to capture information from people. So 1, 2, 3, and I think I did that all right, but we can go ahead and align it just to make sure. The controls are, if you're noticing, if you're familiar at all with PowerPoint, they're pretty similar. Then we're going to add 3 labels, just so people know what we're asking them for. So first name, last name, and email. Okay. And then we also need to add in a button. We edit the name over here, sign up. Cool. And honestly, this is all you need to get started. I'm going to make 2 small tweaks just to make it a little bit easier to use. One, we don't need that text input because that's actually what somebody will see on the screen. So we don't need any default text there. I think that just makes it confusing. And we're also going to change the names of these input fields. And we're doing that for later. It's just going to be confusing to remember text input 1 is first name, text input 1-1 is last name. It's a lot easier just to do first name input. And email input. Okay, and let's just preview that real fast. That's looking good to me. This is a front end, so we don't actually have anything happening in this app. You could select sign up as much as you want. Nothing's going to happen. This is just the presentation, how we're capturing the data. What actually is going to do the work is going to be a Power App. So we're going to select sign up, action, or it's a Power Automate workflow, sorry. So you get a select from a whole bunch of workflows that you already made. We're going to create a new one. That's going to take us into Power Automate. We're going to select a Power Apps button. And it'll kick us off. Let me do webinar 51, simple. And I'd emphasize it's really important to name these descriptively, especially if you have a lot of workflows. The names can get confusing. So from here, and again, if at any point you're getting a little bit lost, you want a little bit more of an explanation of Power Automate, I'd encourage you to go back and watch our previous webinar. We start from the ground up. We go a lot more into detail about the Power Automate interface. So if this is overwhelming you, maybe go back and look at that first and then come back to this. So we're going to add a step. We're using a premium connector. I'm going to go to Blackbaud. Individual constituent. We're going to create a constituent, and we want to use information that Power Apps is going to give us. So it'll say, okay, hey, we need the first name. We need, and this is where it'll try and trick you. You need to see more to get another one, and then we need to add in the email information. So I believe type is required. Let's go ahead and say it's their primary. They're entering on our form. Use see more and ask in Power Apps. So what we're doing is we're saying, hey, based on the 3 pieces of data that we're collecting in Power Apps, create an individual constituent, filling in that information in this form. And then we're also going to create a constituent code because this is a volunteer. I did the wrong thing. Apologies. And we're going to select this constituent code. Create a constituent code. We're going to say, hey, that person that we just created, we're going to use their ID. And then we're going to make them, and this pulls from a list of all the constituent codes in your database already. Do volunteer. And then let's also create an action, just letting us know that they went through the effort to sign up for this. and create a constituent action. For this, you might think, okay, hey, it's an ID. Use an ID right here. That's good. Wrong. Sometimes Power Automate, it tries to trick you. So this is the ID of that constituent code that you just created, not the ID of the individual constituent that you created. So you need the ID of the constituent that you just created. You can't put an action on a constituent code. It needs to know where it needs to go. So if you ever see anything unexpected or erroring out, go ahead and recheck those IDs. That's a common point. Even for me, I play around with this a lot. It can be something that trips you up. So we're going to do completed. See now, this is just a fancy way of saying at this point in time. And the summary is kind of so signed up to be a volunteer. And then going to be used Power App. Okay, so let's save that. And this is looking pretty good so far. So again, based on the information we get from our Power App, as long as we pass it that information, then it's going to create a constituent code, and then create a constituent action. So let's go back into our Power App. Okay, and so you see that now it's added this new webinar workflow. We're going to add this to our app. And then now that app is associated, or that workflow is associated with our button, and we need to pass it the information that it needs. So we need the first name. And again, this is why I labeled these. I don't want to have to remember input 1 is first name. The other thing is, whenever you're calling anything in Power Apps, I would go ahead and if you think you're done, go ahead and put a period to see if there are additional properties. It'll just save you a lot of pain and heartache. I guess the way of thinking about it is that this input field actually has a couple of different properties. It may give you the right property. It may not. It's always better to specify it. So okay, so we're getting the first name, the last name, and the email, and we're going to run our workflow. Okay, so let's save this. And let's go ahead and try running it. So we're going to use my dad's name. And I may have already added him to the database, so we're going to use his middle name also. And we're going to say KDJ at. And under pain of death, I'm not allowed to tell you his middle name. He's very embarrassed by it. So let's go ahead and hit sign up. So it's running. It's thinking about what it's doing. Okay, so it looks like it finished. There aren't those bars at the top. So let's go ahead and go back to the main page of our workflow. So we'll see, okay, hey, we had a successful run. And if you click into this, you can see all the details. So we got this information from our Power App. We went ahead and created a constituent code. Okay, so it says it worked. Well, let's just go ahead and go into, I was testing something earlier. So let's just try this out. D. Jackson. Okay. All right, yes, so we have Carl D. Jackson. We have a volunteer. He's a volunteer. We have his primary email address, and we have this task, this action that we gave him. So it gave us all this information. And again, yeah, totally came in just from that form. We're good. You may be thinking to yourself as we go back in, hey, like that's great if somebody wants to enter in their information, but what if they do it more than once? Or what if they're already a constituent in our database? Well, there are a couple ways that you can get around that, and I'll talk about that in the next demo. And so, as I just mentioned, you may be thinking, hey, this is great, but what about quality control? What about duplicate management? Everything like that. You have a couple different options. I'm going to show you the simplest one. So we're going to go ahead and remove this from this button. We're going to add and create a different workflow. You might have a couple different options here. You might you could add people to a spreadsheet for later. You could tag them with a specific custom field to go back and audit for. I'm going to do the simplest option, which just going to create a new workflow here just to make sure that it's easy to find and I don't accidentally mess something up. So I'm going to do webinar duplicates 51. Always make sure you're naming that. So I'm going to say, based on what I see in the Power App, so I'm going to add in so I want to search for the constituent. So I'm going to do a search first, and I'll wait on putting anything in there. It's just a little bit easier. So I'm going to start an approval. So how mine is going to work is for every time that somebody fills this out, what I want somebody to do, and in this case, I'm asking myself, volunteer sign up request. Okay, and I'm going to ask myself, Cody Jackson. Cool, so I'm going to say a volunteer named just try to sign up, a search for them. And if I really wanted to, I can include the search results in here. Again, I'm trying to make this as simple as possible. And so based on the outcome of that approval, if it contains approve, I believe. Yep, if it contains approve, so if the outcome is an approval, then I'm going to create a constituent. And again, need to go down and want them to ask me that in Power Apps. See more, ask me in Power Apps. And yeah, let's go ahead and just put in that email again. Type. And ask me in Power Apps. And now that I've created these fields down here, and I just wanted to do this so it's a little bit clear what they relate to, I can add in this information for my search. So I want to do a search on first name, last name, and then I want to add that information here. Oop. Scroll down a bit too far. First name, last name. Oop. That's weird. Last name. So let's save this. And so again, let's just walk through it really fast. So what it's saying is it's again, take this information from Power Apps, and if some things are true, we do the exact same thing that we did before. Do the exact same thing. We go ahead and create an individual constituent. We could add other things if we wanted to, but only if. So we search for that, we return information about the search, and then we ask somebody, is this person a duplicate? And again, this doesn't, meet all of your use options. Maybe you have, multiple conditions of if they're a duplicate, just find the right person and then add it to their record. If they're not, create a new constituent. You can go a lot of different ways. I'm trying to keep this simple. So what we're going to do is we just created this workflow, the duplicates. We're going to add it into our volunteer sign up form. To this button, it's adding it, and so now we need to hook in the values again. Text, last name, .text, and email. .text. Okay. Great. So let's just save this one more time. And let's jump into previewing it. Let's try the same name that we did before. KDJ. Let's try signing up. Okay, and so let's watch the workflow in action. So it's running. So the Power App fired, we're searching for the constituent. It's going to start and wait for an approval. And what this does natively is it sends an email to whoever, is the approving person. So in a second, I'm going to get an email. As you'll see, you'll also be able to get that information if you have action items within Flow. You can go ahead and I should have this approval. Yep, volunteer sign-up request. I should be getting it in my email pretty soon. Not yet. But at any rate, it'll come through my email, but I can show you what it looks like here. So it's saying, hey, we have a volunteer sign-up request. Here's a volunteer, here's his name, there's one record. So I'm going to go ahead and say reject. And again, I could actually do this from the email itself. But I'm going to do it from within the interface. Let's say I'm already here building some workflows. I'm going to confirm that. Okay, so I rejected that response. And that is the wrong one. That is the old one. So we started the approval. What happened? So we rejected it. And that means that we did not create an individual constituent. So let's see. So we had Carl D. Jackson. And so so we only have one. We don't have any more. And that's one simple way of doing duplicate control. Again, there are a lot of different ways you can do it. I'm just trying to go for the simplest one. And so in the final demo, we'll show how you can do this without even using Power Automate, how you all just do this within the interface of Power Apps itself. And so we're on to our third and final tutorial today. And if what you already saw is good enough for you, if you prefer something a little bit simpler, you get a little bit scared by working directly with code, I would encourage you either, just end the webinar here or just kind of plug your ears and hum for a little bit. It will look a little bit scary. It's a little bit complicated to only use a Power App. But this definitely isn't your only option. There's simpler options available. This is something you're going to want to do if you want total control over the process, and maybe you want something that's a little bit more maintainable for the long term. But so what we're going to do, so we're going to remove this workflow. We don't need anymore. Everything that's happening is going to happen within Power Apps itself. So what we need to do is to connect Razor's Edge NXT. So that way we have access to the connector within Power Apps. So within this formula bar, so you can either go into advanced and choose on select. I prefer to work with this formula bar up top. There's a little bit more space. So we're going to say, hey connector. So Blackbaud. And we'll just use that to fill in, create individual constituent. And now we're going to have to give it some information first. And this format is going to look a little bit different. Let me fill it out and then I'll explain why. Individual, last name, input.text. And then we pass in a bunch of other information. So it's going to be first name, input.text, email, type. Is that a lowercase? True and address. Okay. Let's go ahead and format that. So everything's looking right. So there are two things you may notice. So the first thing that you may be noticing if you aren't familiar with Power, if you're only familiar with Power Automate or you're not familiar with an API call, is hey, that's kind of weird. Why do I need to have all of these things nested inside of each other? So this is really what Power Automate is doing under the hood for you. There are different properties within this email attribute. So it has a type, it's a primary, there's an address. It's kind of making that easier for you where you don't have to think about how things are nested. The thing you may be thinking about if you are familiar with an API call is, let me jump over to this constituent API reference. So if I were to, hold on, it's thinking for a moment. Okay, so if I, still thinking. So if I were to create a constituent using the API, which is known as post, that's just a kind of more developer term that you would need to know. So if you're doing this, just scroll down, you're actually passing in all of these are first level properties. None of them are kind of elevated. All of these are within this object, which is weird if you're familiar with that because Power Automate doesn't work that way. So what it's doing is anything that's required is a top level property, and then everything else is contained in the body of the message. So it's however many first, required fields you have, then it's an object with everything else. So that's all well and good. Hopefully that's at least a little bit clear. So if I want to do this, this is great. So let me say, okay, I'm satisfied with that. Now I want to do another action. I want to create that constituent code. So let me say create constituent code. Okay, so now here's where I run into a problem. So Power Automate did this for me. It already knew what the ID was. So that means what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually have to change up this first call. So I'm going to say, instead of the first thing I'm doing, I'm going to do set constituent ID and do that. So what it's saying is, and I know this again, you just have to be very familiar with how the API works. So whenever you create a constituent successfully, it'll actually send you back and say, hey, here's the ID of the person you just created. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to say, hey, when this thing completes, this creating a new constituent completes, it's going to send me back a value. I'm going to capture that value, which is set in constituent ID, so that way I can use it in the future. So I'm going to create a constituent code, so constituent ID. And actually, if you go away, it'll yell at you because it's saying it's not the right type. So if you noticed on that response, it's giving you an object with an ID, so you need to do dot ID. Again, just emphasizing if you ever see something that you don't expect, just start adding dots until it works. So constituent ID, and I want the description to be volunteer, which I believe description, and again, you have to be get very familiar. So I'm going to do post a constituent code. The API reference is going to be your best friend in this, just because you have to have a level of technical knowledge. And that's taken a little bit too long. You're just going to have to take my word for it. That's how it works. And then we'll add another, let's go ahead and format that. Okay, and then let's add a Blackbaud Abrasive Edge. Create constituent. Just create action. Okay, create action. And then the constituent ID, again, it's that constituent ID.id. for this it actually gives us a list of pre-filled values, task other, and then the date, it's going to be UT. I think it's just today. Yeah, let's just use today. And then we add in a whole bunch of information, and you can hover over here to get more about that. I'm going to say I only want it to do a description of volunteer sign up. And then I'll need to close that. Okay, so that should be everything we need. And again, I've actually included this on the following slide, just as a reference. So if I have this, so I'm going to save it. And now let's go ahead and test it out. So this is essentially the same thing that we were doing in the first Power Automate workflow. We're just doing this all from within the connector. And it's basically just like bowling with the, where you don't have the guardrails up. So we'll do that. Let's go ahead and play it. We'll try Cody I forget how many of these I've added. So let's do Cody S. Jackson at ksj@he.com. And it might take a little bit to think about it. Okay. So Cody S. Yeah, so it worked. So it went ahead and created our constituent, added the constituent code, added an action. Again, exact same thing as before. The thing that I will say, and I believe you have to publish this to see it. I'll just show you using another app that I've already published. Oops, sorry about that, folks. So you can't go through, because for Power Automate, we're able to kind of track it via this workflow. We could see all the different function calls and what it was returning. For Power Apps, the way that you do that is by monitoring the app. So you select monitor, you start a session, and here we'll bring this into a new tab. We'll say test at test.com. So we hit sign up, and then it's going to go and create something. But so you'll see on all of these, here are different things that are happening on the screen. I'm selecting, I'm changing the properties. It's showing, hey, you did create a constituent. Hey, the constituent code was also successful. The create action was successful. If we test, okay, apparently we made a lot of tests in preparation for this webinar, but you get the idea. You can kind of see what's happening under the hood. And it just makes it a lot easier to find potential issues when you don't have that Power Automate workflow in front of you.
So as I mentioned in that demo, here is that reference slide. We do have a sample app of that uploaded onto our volunteer sign-up tutorial. It's at I believe it's at the top, where it might be towards the kind of like do more things to improve your app. But we have that also. Just here's a reference slide. Take a look at it, screenshot it if that's helpful at all. If you're just calling the connector within Power Apps. So just a couple of tips for Power Apps, and I believe I called these out in the demos. One, just build iteratively. Start small, just in the sense of, one, it's easy to get frustrated. It can get really complicated really fast. So starting small helps you know, hey, I know exactly what the problem is, and also I know how to get there, and I'm not losing hope or, getting too discouraged. Second one is learning the data structures, as you saw, knowing what properties are available both on each things in the interface and Power Apps, and then also how data structures work with API calls is so important. That API reference is going to become your best friend. 3, debug prior to launch, so whether you're using monitoring or a Power Automate workflow, just make sure you know exactly what you're doing, especially if you're changing information in your database. And then finally, and this will be something that's important, if you're, for a couple of these examples, think about gallery view. So if you're ever wanting somebody or, like a board member or a fundraiser to see a list of constituents, you're going to be using gallery view for that. We didn't have time to get to that in the demo today, but it's just a very important concept and something that's, really helpful if you want to show a lot of information. So now that we've seen an example of how Power Apps works in practice in our examples, what are some other places you can use where you can use Power Apps in combination with Razor's Edge NXT? So the first one is going to be to embed business processes. So you'll see a couple of examples where people have built tiles just directly into Razor's Edge NXT. The second one is going to be to extend view access, so maybe you want more people to see something in your system, whether that's a list of constituents or maybe you want to generate a board report. The other one might be to extend edit access, and the best example for that is that volunteer sign-up form that we built today. So if we're thinking about embedding business processes, one of the most common use cases that we've seen, or something that's really been helpful, is to consolidate email experiences. So say you're on a constituent record, you think of something, you need to send an email to them, you can do that right within the interface and then track it as an action. Another embedded business process that we've seen is adding premiums to gift records. Some organizations, they have a lot of emphasis on, hey, like you gave this amount, I'm going to give you this sort of thing. And so adding those premiums, you can do that directly within Razor's Edge NXT. You can be targeting the constituent, adding that to the record. It's very easy, reduces a lot of the workload on your staff. Other one is auto-generating proposals. So this is maybe you're connecting with SharePoint, Microsoft Word, and data from NXT to submit a proposal for approval. So hey, we want to move forward with this opportunity and pull in a lot of information from the constituent record just to really, reduce that monotonous paperwork. If we're talking about extending view access, this is something that one of our internal folks built. It's basically a board dashboard. So it's pulling data from Power BI, from Dynamics 365, and from Razor's Edge NXT to show your board everything that they need to know and showing that to them in a way that updates dynamically to where you don't have to keep on pulling those reports. And finally, I mentioned the extend edit access. There are other applications, but the volunteer sign-up form is probably the most common. That's what we just built today. I would say definitely think about building in some quality control, just because you don't want, you want to be very careful with what you're letting people access. And then we have this quick poll. Just give you a second there to fill it out. And just there's some information about that poll if you were curious. And this is our final slide for today's webinar. Just if you want to learn more, I'd encourage you to either check out the other recorded webinars. They're definitely great resources done by some very smart people. We have documentation, so if you go to the developer.blackbaud.com and look for our documentation and then the Microsoft Power Platform, we have a whole site filled with tutorials and some actually flows and apps that you can download and then import and then get up and running in about 5 minutes. You can also learn about our connector reference at docs.microsoft.com/connectors/Blackbaud Razor's Edge. Then you can also engage with the Power Platform community to share your questions, ideas, tips, tricks, everything like that. It's been really exciting already. A couple of people have jumped in and started asking questions and helping each other out. So that is just all the resources that you have to follow up after this webinar. If you have any questions, I'd encourage you to go post them in the community. I'll be looking out for those. And other than that, thank you so much for your attendance today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.